Well, good evening. How engaged should the United States be in the world? How much do our alliances and our global military presence benefit us? And to what extent do they drain our resources or tempt us into costly missteps? I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this debate on the crucial issue of America's role in the world. This debate is one in a series co-hosted by the Brookings Institution and the Charles Koch Institute, and I'm pleased that we at Dartmouth's Dickey Center have been able to partner with these great institutions for this event. And I want to welcome my old friend Bruce Jones, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at Brookings, and Will Ruger, who is Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. I also want to thank their terrific staffs for their great work in putting this event together. I want to also note that I'm particularly glad that we are in an era awash with incendiary rhetoric going to debate this issue in a way that may remind us of what civilized discourse is all about. Our participants tonight are Eugene Gholz, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He works primarily at the intersection of national security and economic policy on subjects including innovation, defense management, and U.S. grand strategy. He wrote a well-known international security article that coined the term restraint as a proposed grand strategy for the United States. So that sort of gives away where he is. Jennifer Lind is Associate Professor of Government here at Dartmouth and our resident expert on the international relations of East Asia. She is the author of Sorry States, Apologies and International Politics, one of my favorite titles of all time, a book that examines the effect of war memory on international reconciliation. She is affiliated with the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard, as well as Chatham House in London. Constanze Stelzenmuller, an expert on German, European, and transatlantic foreign and security policy, is the inaugural Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center on the U.S. and Europe at Brookings. Her areas of expertise include transatlantic relations, German foreign policy, NATO, the EU's foreign security and defense policy, and many other things. She has been head of the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund and an editor and correspondent at the great German weekly Die Zeit. Jake Sullivan is the Magro Family Distinguished Fellow in International Affairs at the Dickey Center here at Dartmouth. Jake served in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, Director of Policy Planning at the United States Department of State, and Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary Clinton. He helped lead the secret diplomacy that paved the way for the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Stephen Wertheim is a historian at Columbia University. He researches U.S. foreign relations and the international order from the 19th century to the present. Before coming to Columbia, Stephen Wertheim was a permanent lecturer in history at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He is currently writing a book about the birth of U.S. global supremacy in World War II. Finally, and most importantly, our moderator tonight is Daryl Press, who is an associate professor of government at Dartmouth. He focuses on U.S. national security policy, and in particular, the changing balance of power, the evolution of technology and warfare, and the future of deterrence. In the interest of full disclosure, he is closely related to one of our debaters, but he promises not to be in any way partial. And with that, let me turn it over to Will Ruger of CKI.
Thank you. And by being partial, I assume you meant Eugene Gholz because they've co-authored together. So didn't want to forget that. But thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. This is my once and hopefully at some point in my life, maybe in retirement, future home state. So it's always great to be here. And also it's great to have this partnership with the Brookings Institution and for this debate with Dickey. So again, thank you all for coming. You know, at Charles Koch Institute and the Charles Koch Foundation, we think it's vitally important that we encourage civil discourse about important matters that relate to our flourishing as individuals and as a society. And what could be more important in many ways. Now, again, I'm a foreign policy guy, so of course I'll say this, but what could be more important than thinking about America's role in the world, given that sometimes this means conflict, war, which is one of the most important kind of independent variables if we're here on campus that affects so many aspects of our lives here in our country and abroad. But again, just to echo what Dan said, the civil discourse aspect of this relationship between the Charles Koch Institute and the Brookings Institution is just so important, especially at this moment in American history, where we haven't seen that kind of discussion about important issues. It's oftentimes kind of a crossfire approach, tweeting in ways that are less than civil. And we think that we can model this, and we are doing that together across the country. This is phase 2 of a CKI Brookings Institution debate series. Last year, we took this around the country to several cities, and this year we're doing this again, and we're very excited about renewing this partnership. And so again, thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to the debaters.
Terrific. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Dan. Good evening and welcome to the first debate of the second season of America's Changing Role in the World, convened by the Brookings Institution and the Charles Koch Institute. I'm Daryl Press, and it's a pleasure to be here in Hanover, New Hampshire for tonight's debate, organized in partnership with the John Sloan Dickey Center here at Dartmouth. The question for tonight's debate is brief, but it's far from simple. What should America's role in the world be? The question encompasses a range of issues. What are America's national interests for the coming century, and how should it pursue them? What are the attributes that the United States should look for in potential allies and partners around the world? What approaches can the United States take to improve our relations with the other powerful countries in the world, in particular Russia and China? Tonight we're going to delve into these and other issues in 4 segments. We're going to start by giving each of our debaters 3 minutes to make an opening set of statements to try to describe their position. We'll have a 30-minute section of moderated debate, 20 minutes of audience questions and answers, and then we'll give each debater 2 minutes to give a closing statement. To keep the conversation moving along, our debaters have been asked to limit their interventions to 90 seconds, but I strongly encourage them to interact with each other. So I'll direct a question to one of you. I might invite a second of you to interact and to engage as well. But all of you, please, jump in, argue with each other, try to point out areas of agreement and disagreement. And when it's time that we have to move on, that'll be my responsibility. But we're here to see you guys wrestle with your ideas with each other. Our audience will be able to submit questions in writing on note cards that have been passed around already, which will be collected at about the 20-minute mark by the debate organizers. If you're sitting in the audience and you want a note card but you don't have one yet, then either now or sometime into the debate, raise your hand, try to catch the eye of one of the organizers, and they'll bring you a note card and you can submit your questions. With that, let me dive right in and let me invite each of our speakers to make an opening statement. Why don't we just move left to right? So Constanze, I'm going to ask you to go first. If you could take 3 minutes and describe your overarching vision and the principles that you'd suggest that the United States implement to achieve it.
All right. Well, obviously, as a European on the panel here, I feel I'm here in a supporting role, and it's really not for me to advise America. But since American foreign and security policy has consequences for Europe, as we have seen since 1945 and before, I have an interest in America not going the full restraint route. At the same time, it's clear that it needs to turn back from some of the errors of the past of what you could call hegemonic or unilateral hubris. So I would like to see an enlightened America that acts according to principles but with measured realism, that makes a difference between its allies and its adversaries and challengers and treats them accordingly, that does not try to split the European Union to pursue bilateral relationships with each of us, and that sees in us not just allies and fellow fighters for a better international order, but also a continent with which it is deeply intertwined, culturally, politically, economically, socially, and that it therefore has a vested interest in preserving. Thank you.
Terrific. Eugene.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me up. I guess the introduction outed me that I support a strategy of restraint for the United States. I think the most important thing to start with is that we should be humble and prudent about what military power can achieve for the United States. The biggest threat, I think, to the United States, is a word that Constanze used, is hubris. The temptation that we have such a great military a truly great military, that it leads us to believe that that military can achieve anything. And also, it leads us to believe that good outcomes are impossible without American military leadership. We have such confidence in our military. And that leads us to overestimate our capabilities in the world. When we try to shape international events, when we try to be too forward with our military, to believe that we can achieve too much, we create nationalist pushback in the world. And when we're scared of other countries and feel we should engage them primarily militarily, that leads to the self-fulfilling prophecy of other countries viewing us as hostile, and it creates the tension that we were worried about when we initially engaged with them. It's very hard for us to understand the political implications of trying to use our military overseas. Understanding the politics of far-off countries is very difficult. We struggle to understand our own politics. Very few people predicted the rise of President Trump. We have tremendous diversity of views among people who wish to challenge President Trump about what's the right strategy for how to challenge him. The idea that we could develop good ideas or good strategies for shaping or manipulating the politics of other countries is foolhardy given the limits of our understanding. Fortunately, many of the tensions of the world are far away from the United States. We spend tremendous resources building aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and all the rest so that we can reach out to other countries and try to influence their events. Our challenge strategically should be to have other countries pay the cost, if they should choose to challenge us in the future, of paying the cost that it would take them to come and challenge us, instead of us going to challenge them. We should take our resources, take our best people who we're attracting to our military to fight in foreign lands, and have them invest in renewing the United States, in trying to keep our powder dry and prepare our resources for future fights that we might unfortunately face. Now is not the time to be using up those resources, right? We know that it's hard to win away games, much easier to win home games. We should let our strategy take advantage of that fact.
Thank you. Jake.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up, not because it's a power move, but because it's just slightly awkward to sit on these stools. So when I get the chance to stand, I'm going to stand.
We're probably going to be falling off.
Yeah, and I invite my fellow panelists to do the same. So I'm going to start by saying I completely agree with Eugene that the United States should curb the extent to which it's using its military to solve problems around the world. I don't think you're going to hear anyone up here make the case that the Iraq War was a good idea, or that we have not had a severe imbalance in our military tools versus our diplomatic, economic, and soft power tools. But the story can't end there. It can't just end with we're not going to do that. What are we for? What is American foreign policy all about? And I would argue that there are more threats than just hubris to the United States, and they fall into two categories. One category are threats that transcend states, and we can identify them: the ravages of climate change, the spread of nuclear weapons, the possibility of a global epidemic that could kill tens of millions of people, including in our own country, a global financial crisis that could turn a Great Recession into a Great Depression, and the growing challenges of technology, cyber, artificial intelligence, and the like that can transform not just our society, our economy, but our society. And here's the thing about each one of these challenges. None of them can be solved. None of these threats can be met by one country acting alone. They all require international cooperation to solve. But that cooperation doesn't happen spontaneously. And it doesn't happen by committee. It happens when a leader comes along who tries to galvanize and mobilize countries to pull together to solve these challenges. And I believe that the United States has a key role to play in doing exactly that, to mobilizing collective action to solve these shared threats. And I would further submit to you that that is going to have to look different for the next 50 years than it did for the last 50 years. But we're already moving in that direction. We had something called the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States was out of, and which was this sort of formal top-down institution. Then the Obama administration helped drive and achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, which the Trump administration has pulled out of, but is fundamentally the right idea, built on American diplomacy and American leadership. There's a second set of threats as well, and those are threats that emerge from states that do not share our values and do not wish us well. That is certainly the case of Russia, and increasingly it appears it could be the case with China too. Now, I do not support a new Cold War with China, and there's too much of that crazy talk in Washington, D.C. right now. But I do believe that we are best off if we are confronting our competitors and adversaries with a united front of allies who are force multipliers, who, yes, do bear burdens, who do step up with us to try to shape the rules of the road going forward, to help make sure that fight never comes to our shores. And so I believe that to both deal with the threats beyond states and the threats from states, the United States needs to be active and engaged in the world, and I look forward to talking more about what that vision would look like as we get into this debate.
Stephen.
Well, thank you. I will remain sitting because I don't have Jake's energy. In my view, this is the moment to devise a new role for the United States in the 21st century world, a world that has liberated itself from colonial empires and moved on from the Cold War. Tragically, the United States has often not moved on. It has acted of late like an empire and inflated competitors into grand ideological enemies. It's time, I think, to reset not just our foreign policy, but also the terms of our debate. And let me suggest just 3 ways. First, I think the United States should stop fetishizing its own global military supremacy. Armed dominance has become an end in itself. President Trump has never had a strategy, but he has always wanted to build up the US military, which is already more costly than the next 7 competitors combined. And how has the so-called establishment reacted? Mostly, they've cheered this development and complained that the problem with President Trump is that he's somehow an isolationist. This situation, to me, is perverse, especially coming after several decades in which pursuing perpetual primacy hasn't produced peace, but rather plunged Americans into perpetual conflict. Primacy can create antagonisms when people face US interventions and a global military presence that includes 800 bases spanning the globe. And now, as we see other powers start to rise, the dangers of pursuing primacy are likely to rise as well. Second, by no longer coveting supremacy everywhere, the United States can actually be more constructive diplomatically. In the Middle East, for example, America can stop being a party to almost every conflict and start being a party to resolving conflicts. That means having no permanent allies and no permanent enemies, Iran included. The Iranian nuclear deal was, I think, the most constructive and courageous US effort in decades. But in retrospect, it didn't go far enough. The United States continued to cast Iran as a grave threat to itself and deepened its alliance with Iran's enemies in the Gulf. And that's how the United States came to support the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Finally, we need to appreciate that militarized foreign policy corrupts America at home. In order to justify America's global dominance, leaders from both parties constantly tell the public that foreigners want to kill Americans and subvert the world. It should be no surprise when a demagogue then turns fear of deadly foreigners into the basis of his movement. So I think we could have a 21st century foreign policy that would stop inflating enemies and fear and embrace pluralism and peace around the world and for the United States.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me be part of this really exciting debate. This spring, my Dartmouth colleague and I, Bill Woolforth in the government department, we wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs where we talked about the need for a change in US strategy. We talked about the need for a conservative grand strategy that takes into account the big changes we've seen in the world and yet tries to preserve aspects of the international system that we value. So I want to talk about conditions today and why they necessitate such a change. So first of all, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US found itself in a heady power position, a tremendous power advantage relative to any others. At home, Republicans and Democrats broadly shared the view that the US should pursue a strategy of global leadership. And the US shifted, as a result, from a policy of containment of the Soviet Union to a more ambitious policy in which it reinvigorated old alliances, found new allies, pursued democracy promotion, and fought, of course, multiple wars in the Persian Gulf. So today, however, conditions are quite different, and so it should lead us to change our strategy as a result. The US and its allies' share of global GDP was 60%, now it's 40%. As for the share of defense expenditures of the US and its partners, used to be 80%, now it's 52%. At home, the bipartisan consensus about the need for US or the advisability for US global leadership has significantly weakened. And of course, China and Russia are challenging the balance of power by modernizing their militaries, pursuing salami tactics and asymmetric strategies, and also using pretty clever diplomacy to separate the US from its allies. So given this increasingly challenging environment, Bill Woolforth and I argued that the US should pursue a less expansionist, more conservative foreign policy. So instead of continuing to expand to new places and new domains, the US and its partners should consolidate their position. So to put it in New Hampshire terms, we've been hiking a pretty steep path, and we need to pause and catch our breath before charging forward. At least my family can attest to that's how I hike. According to this approach, US leaders should be very cautious in adding any new alliances. And any prospective ally should bring to the table more capabilities than costs. This is a litmus test that has not been applied in recent years. The US should also understand that democracy promotion is seen by Russia and China as an existential threat. And so we should draw a clearer line between official efforts to promote democracy and the kinds of activities that our citizens and NGOs want to engage in. If Washington got out of the regime change business, we'd see just how much of the illiberal countries' revisionism was defensive in nature as opposed to being motivated by their ambition. So to be clear, conservatism today need not mean conservatism forever, but any ambitious enterprise, be it a political movement or a corporation, undergoes phases of expansion and then consolidation. So today, consolidation should be seen as a prudent reaction to the expansionism we've seen for the past 25 years and to the new constraints that we face.
Terrific. Thank you all. So now I've been convinced 5 times. So I'm kind of stuck. And so what we hope to do is use the next 30 minutes trying to draw out, because they all sound terrific, each of your presentations, but maybe draw out some contradictions or draw out areas of tension or areas of disagreement between the 5 of you. Let me start by posing a question. I'll pose the first question to Constanze about US-Russian relations, which is something that's, again, affecting us internationally, affecting us at home. The core of the question is how did things turn so sour and what can we do? But let me kind of preface it by saying that some critics of US foreign policy argue that one important cause of the decline of US-Russian relations is the expansion of NATO and the EU toward Russia's borders. Do you think there's any truth to that claim, number one? And then most importantly, what can we do now to normalize US relations with Russia?
Right, 90 seconds for this. So I have to say, if there's one thing I believe in firmly, then it is that NATO expansion is not about the United States deciding to do something or telling NATO to do something, but all of us as a Western alliance respecting the right of peoples and nations to choose. And if they choose a Western path, we should honor that. And frankly, I think Europe would be a less prosperous and less safe place and less stable place if we had not expanded NATO and the EU in the 1990s and the 2000s. And I think that this case becomes more difficult the farther east we go for a variety of reasons for which 90 seconds is too short. But I think we have an interest in treating the entire Eurasian space as a single strategic space And I believe that all of Europe will be safe and prosperous when Russia becomes a functioning democracy and entertains the notion of joining an alliance with the West under other conditions than those proposed by Putin when he talks about a single space between Lisbon and Vladivostok.
Stephen, you've also written on things that directly bear on this, and you describe two different camps in American foreign policy. One that tends to see the frictions we face in the world as a result of too much coddling of other powers, and one of them that sees the friction being the result of too much bullying of them or too much coercion of them. So when you think about, let's say, the frictions with Russia, where do you come down on this? And also, what do you think about Constanze's answer about what's the solution to the problems with Russia?
Sure.
In 90 seconds.
All right, sure, in 90 seconds.
And I didn't answer that question.
Well, I think what is happening right now, somewhat under the surface of high-level political discourse, is this kind of emerging debate that's opening up on both sides of the political aisle, in which some people are looking toward great power competition with Russia and China as the kind of new basis around which American foreign policy will be oriented, and others are trying to find a way to demilitarize in a significant way. I call these the restraint school, and Eugene and Daryl have all contributed to that school of thought. The restraint school, I think, is actually had NATO expansion at the core of its concerns in the 1990s when it developed, and had this concern from the beginning that whatever the United States told itself about the reasons why NATO would expand, it would not be perceived so non-aggressively by Russia. And I do think that has been a factor. Objectively speaking, it's something that Vladimir Putin cites again and again as a cause for some of his aggressive actions. I don't think it excuses them either. So I think we have to be much more cautious about, it's not just that nations are choosing to join NATO, but also that when they do that, the United States is undertaking a security commitment to defend them.
Let me come back to one other thing that Constanze said. She said that basically the relations with Russia will essentially be difficult until Russia democratizes. Basically, if I were Russian, what I would hear that is that American-Russian relations will be pretty difficult until there's regime change in Russia. Is that how other people on the panel see this? And if that's the case, is there any real hope to a normalized relationship between the United States and Russia with the current regime?
I would call it system change.
System
I would call
change?
it system change, not regime change.
System change in Russia, you mean? Mm-hmm. If you were Putin, would you think that's regime change? But does anybody else, is anybody more optimistic?
I'm not more optimistic. So if someone else is more optimistic, they should go. But I'll give a pessimistic take, if I'm allowed. So first of all, I tried to lead the charge of standing up and failed, which may say something about me being the engaged person in the debate rather than the restrainer, and I'm losing that debate.
Oh, no.
When I was in the Obama administration, during the height of the Ukraine crisis, we made multiple quiet efforts to reach out to the Russians to see if we could produce an off-ramp from that crisis. President Obama was very interested in finding a way to de-escalate the situation. And I think if there's another president in 2021, they're going to do what every past president has done and try and find a way to de-escalate the situation. Put a floor under the US-Russian relationship, which I think is badly needed, because I am worried about the inflammatory rhetoric, the close flights of our planes and ships. We need to get off of this course. However, I believe Vladimir Putin is not interested in getting off of this course. And that is for two reasons. The first is that I think fundamentally it is important to him to have the United States as an adversary for his own domestic political purposes, to challenge US hegemony and unipolarity for his ideological purposes, and to try to undermine American and Western democracy to show our model doesn't work and his works better. I think that's how he wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night. And so entreaties and efforts by the United States to say, let's find a grand bargain with Russia, I think will fall on deaf ears. That is not an argument for enmity or an argument for trying to ratchet tensions up. And that's just a clear-eyed analysis of what I think we're dealing with in Vladimir Putin. And as long as he is president, we're going to have to manage for that. And I think we should manage for that in a way that most reduces the chance for conflict.
Let me try to bring Eugene in this, but by broadening it a little bit. A long time ago, when the world was quite different, 15 years ago, different in important ways. If my memory is right, you raised the question, again, provocative question: is NATO even still necessary? And if NATO is necessary, should the United States be playing a leadership role in NATO? A lot's changed, perhaps, in Europe, souring of relations with Russia. And so the question is, do you still hold that view? Do you think that the European countries could manage these challenges with Russia well without us? Would there be any advantage to the United States in not being at the leadership of this alliance?
To answer your last question, yes, there would be advantage to the United States in not being in the leadership of this alliance, that we would come into, as Jake was saying, less regular, high-intensity, risky potential conflict with the Russians. If we stepped back, we wouldn't be in that position, right? One option for getting out of that position is to hope that the Russians will change or to have system change or whatever it is. Another option is for us to stop poking them in the eye. And I'm in favor of not poking people in the eye. We have limited ability to bring about change in Russia through pushing. Russia has very limited ability to threaten outside of their own neighborhood, other than, they have a bunch of nuclear weapons. They could wake up one day and decide to launch and end it all. But that's not a plausible strategy for the Russians, right? They don't have an ability to push around the Europeans absent us, or to come push on the United States absent us going and putting ourselves in a position to be pushed on. So the Europeans, if you think about potential military capability to defend themselves, you don't need a collective Europe to defend against the Russians. Independently, the situation is the Germans or the French or the British or heck, the Italians can put up a pretty good fight against the Russians. And I'm all in favor of turning NATO into NETO, the Northeast Atlantic Treaty Organization. Europe can still work together the way Constanze would like, just without us, because together they clearly can defend themselves against the Russians. They don't need us. What we bring is added tension for the United States.
So just a quick follow-up. So is part of this view, so do you disagree with Constanze in that is part of your view that you think that something about NATO, maybe expansion of NATO in the EU, is a key root cause of this friction itself, that Russia's reactive to this? Or is this coming from Putin or coming from Russia or coming from something else, and therefore abandonment of NATO is just leaving the Europeans to deal with this problem?
I guess I'm relatively agnostic on, I tend to believe it's very hard to understand the politics of other countries. So I don't want to take a strong position on the causes of Russian belligerence or bad behavior. I do just generally observe that countries are stronger in their backyard and have an interest in having other countries not intervene in their backyard. And so we can cause friction or step away from the friction with Russians, whatever causes them to not want the system change.
So we'll definitely come back to all these themes throughout our time. Let me kind of broaden this regionally a little bit and talk about problems that the United States faces with its partners and allies in both Europe and in Asia. The problem of alliance burden sharing is an enduring one, and it is in both Europe and in Asia. And it seems that almost every US administration says, in very serious tones, burden sharing is a serious concern. We're working on that. We're turning a corner. The allies have promised to do terrific, wonderful new things. But where we stand today, Germany spends 1.2% of its GDP on defense. Japan spends less than 1% of GDP on defense. The United States, by contrast, spends 3.2%. So for Jake and then for Jenny, why should Americans sacrifice to defend allies who aren't willing to pay the money required to defend themselves?
So the first thing I would say is that there's a kind of ahistorical quality to this conversation. It's quite theoretical. I mean, we have actually tried this strategy before of leave Europe to the Europeans and they'll sort it out, and if it comes to our shores, we'll deal with it. That got us the Second World War. And I don't mean to set up a straw man here, but fundamentally, the fact is that no country in NATO has been involved in a military conflict on the European continent since its creation, which is an extraordinary fact that we all now take for granted. They're not fighting each other, and they're not fighting Russia. So from my perspective, the benefits that the United States gets in basic stability, and I agree with Eugene, we shouldn't be poking the Russians in the eye, and I think there are ways to avoid that by having prudent, sensible policies. But the benefits that we get far outstrip this debate about the 2%. That being said, I do believe that Europe should end up paying more, and I think we should be putting more pressure on the Europeans. Asia is a different case, where in fact both Korea and Japan engage in major contributions to the alliance, to the point where if we actually withdrew our forces from those places and brought them back to the United States, Rand suggests we would lose money, not save money, because they're paying a huge portion of it. And so from my perspective, it is fair to ask for more burden sharing from our allies, but I wouldn't think of it strictly in dollars and cents terms. I would think about it in terms of the capabilities that those allies can bring to bear on new challenges, around corruption being used as a national security tool, around cybersecurity, around counterterrorism, more than thinking just hit a certain dollar figure, which I don't think really captures where the essential value of the alliance is.
But let me just ask a quick follow-up, which is, if I'm just a semi-informed observer and I see the major European countries spending so little on their defense, I think there's only two things I could draw from that. And one is that they simply disagree with you and Constance, and they feel fundamentally safe. Or alternatively, they really feel that there's real danger out there, but they're taking advantage of us.
Yeah.
And so what's the combination of those two things going on?
I think it's a symbiotic relationship. They get a benefit out of it for sure, but so do we. Because I think part of the question we need to ask, and I struggle with this, especially in the year 2019, is the solution to European security a really powerful German military? I don't know.
Or a German nuclear bomb.
Or a German nuclear bomb? I mean, I could make the case that that's not true, that actually the United States benefits from serving the role that it does in maintaining stability on the European continent, and that a lot of what we now argue is the kind of tension and challenge is at a level so far below what it has been in history, without the United States having to get into another war in the area. And so I guess my argument is, do I think Germany should be spending more on its defense and certainly on particular capabilities? Of course I do. Do I think Germany is getting a lot out of the United States playing this defensive role? Absolutely they are. But I think the United States is getting a lot out of it too. And this is not an argument for ratcheting up tensions with Russia. It's an argument which says that if you have a strong deterrent, what is happening in Ukraine now doesn't happen in Poland and Hungary and then eventually march eastward. And as a result, I believe NATO has ended up being an extraordinarily successful investment for the United States, alliance for the United States, and it has put us in a position to have strong relationships with these countries that we can leverage in other ways as well, ways far beyond the military, that involve working together as like-minded countries, which I think if you entirely remove the security equation, you'd be less likely to be able to build a united front, say, on trade vis-a-vis China. So I'm a strong believer in maintaining our alliance with Europe in this way.
So I asked Jenny a question on this, and I'll come back to all the panelists on this topic. So Jenny, the only country in the world, the only ally of the United States who makes Germany look good in this score is Japan, right? So on one hand, we have Japan, as you listen to American foreign policy analysts, especially ones who are skeptical of China, they talk about the rising China threat, and we know about China's terrible history with Japan. And a decade ago, riots in China where they're holding up signs that say, kill all Japanese, and these horrific things. And then you have Japan spending 0.9% of its GDP on defense. And the question is, do people in Japan just fundamentally disagree and think there's nothing to be afraid of with respect to China?
They're afraid. Yeah, they're afraid. I guess I would take a step back and go to your question as you posed it initially, kind of a broader question about how this is a fundamental issue. This issue in burden sharing is a fundamental issue with respect to not just the US-Japan alliance, but to all American alliances. And I think it comes down to kind of a paradox with respect to credibility and the need that Americans feel for the need to maintain credibility with its allies. So credibility is a really important thing if you're in an alliance. You want to reassure your ally that you will be there when the time comes. And also credibility is important for deterrence, for deterring the adversary. And so for that reason, it's understandable that US leaders talk quite a lot about the need for the US to appear as a very credible ally. But then at the same time, if all we're doing is telling our allies, you can believe in us, and if we're paying the lion's share of mobilizing the lion's share of capabilities for the alliance and doing the lion's share of defense spending, then they start to get the feeling that maybe they can free ride on that. They can spend less and buy things like maglev trains and 35-hour work weeks. Wouldn't you? I mean, it seems like a great deal. So this is this kind of fundamental paradox, which is we need to reassure our allies in order to deter and reassure. But at the same time, there's that dilemma with burden sharing that it creates. So I guess I can say that with respect to the US-Japan alliance, we're in pretty favorable circumstances to have this conversation. We've been having it for 70 years. We'll keep having it. We keep asking the Japanese to pay more, to do more, and under some conditions they do. And one of those conditions is when they perceive a real security threat. Today, they're looking at a rising superpower in their backyard. And that superpower has designs on territory that Japan believes is theirs. That country educates its people in a very hostile narrative about Japan. The kind of terrifying signs people holding up during the 2012 protests being one example. So the Japanese are afraid. This is not us saying, hey, why don't you come fight in Iraq with us? This is different. They care. This matters. And then the other thing that's favorable is that the US and Japan have been working together for decades and have a very close, very warm and trusting relationship. So burden sharing is always going to be a challenging conversation, a challenging negotiation for the reasons that I talked about. But there are some favorable signs in this particular situation.
So I have to say, this is where my conflict of interest comes up, because I am a little bit more worried about cutting off you when you hit 3 minutes than I am cutting off. There might be some secondary consequences, but let me, again, I think this is a core issue. I want to give Stephen, and if Eugene or Constance wants to say something about this. I mean, is there any threshold that the United States should reasonably hold to its allies that say, if you're not willing to be an equal partner to combat dangers in your backyard, we're not a partner with you? Is that going too far?
It's probably not a uniform threshold, but look, I think we're in a pretty bad place in our foreign policy debate when it comes to alliances. President Trump has actually delivered more of the same, just nastier. He's browbeat our allies. He's had a lot of tweets and fury, but he's not willing to do the one thing that would actually provide a significant incentive in the direction of burden sharing, which is cut US defense spending, or work with allies in a responsible way to withdraw some of US forward deployed forces so that the allies can step up. So that has not been an effective approach. And then the reaction to him has often been to talk about allies as if it's this, morality tale. And that's not what an alliance is. Alliances are there for the purpose of war making, and it shouldn't be something that we glorify quite in this way. So somehow we have to get back to a place where we do take the strategic discussion seriously. And I think that if we're not going to be willing to make some cuts in defense spending, then we can stop paying lip service to burden sharing as a goal, because it's not going to happen. At the end of the day, that's the really effective way to incentivize our allies. But I think the real reason is not so much in terms of saving costs for the United States, in terms of dollars and cents. It actually helps with our security, that we're not so forward deployed, and we get a sense from other countries in the neighborhood of countries like Russia and China, what their assessment of the threat really is when we can judge by their actions. If we don't do that, then we are actually depriving ourselves of a much more finely attuned sense of where the danger lies.
Constanze?
Yes, I would love to jump in here. For one, just on the record, I want Germany to spend more on defense and to live up to its commitments. And I would like Europeans to essentially be able to take care of small to medium-sized security crises and their periphery without American help. Yeah. That is basically what my European security tribe is discussing these days. But in a way that is totally NATO compatible. So if anything should ratchet out of control, turn into major war, we would be fully compatible and working together with American forces. That would be my ideal. But what I think is completely missing from the discussion so far is a really important fact. It's important for us Europeans, it's also important for you in Europe, which is that you are economically interdependent with us in Europe in ways that I think do not factor into this discussion at all and into much of the security debate that I'm witnessing in Washington and that I think the Trump administration gets badly wrong. You have huge economic interests, financial flows, trade, production, jobs in Europe, that if you are protecting the security and prosperity of Europe, you are also protecting that. Conversely, we have jobs and financial flows and trade with you in America, and by being your allies and your partners, we're protecting that. But we also need to understand that both the Russians and the Chinese, while they may not be attacking physically the territory of the European Union or of NATO, they are interfering in our systems every single day in ways that, as our colleague Tom Wright would put it, are short of war. Yeah. Hybrid measures. In ways that are aggressive, that are purposeful, that are very tangible to us, and that are very tangible to you. Your diplomats know about this, your intelligence services know about this, we are all fully aware. And in other words, our interdependence is being weaponized against us by these powers. China and Russia are now European powers. And you have an interest in deciding the outcome of that fight. So while I think we need to focus, I'm a liberal hawk, I'm even an interventionist, and to a certain degree, we need military preparedness and deterrence. There is a huge aspect of this, which is about the resilience of our societies, our economies, our political systems, for which we aren't spending the time that we need to prepare, to deter, to defend on our own and with you. And that is what we ought to be talking about more.
So Eugene, I want to switch us over and talk a little bit about China, but I want to give you 30 seconds if you want it, or do you want us to just move on? I was going to come to you as the second person after Jenny on China. So which would you prefer?
We're behind schedule.
Okay.
Go.
Jenny, China, let me cut to the chase. Is it a threat?
So
In the 1990s, American policymakers welcomed the rise of China. China's getting rich. They're going to be a trade partner. Is the rise of China a threat to the United States and its allies, and why? And then I'm going to ask Eugene the same question.
So it's definitely wrong to overstate the fact that China is threatening. China obviously has strong interdependence of the kind that Constanze is talking about. It values the system and even values U.S. leadership in lots of different ways. So it's not this kind of Soviet-esque spoiler, right? It's different. It's in many ways inside the system and cooperating in the system in some ways and benefits from the system. So I think that's a really important thing to understand. I mean, we benefit in so many ways from a wealthy, prosperous, engaged China, and from the talents and leadership of the Chinese people. I mean, this is just a really good thing for the world. For those though who say that this is in the early 1990s, that was the mantra. That China benefits, China respects the system and all that. And I think what we've seen, though, is that it's become pretty clear over the last decade or so that China has very different interests and very different goals from the US and its liberal partners. So for example, you can talk about the balance of power. So the US-led or the current international order, or however you want to call it, rests on a certain balance of power. And China's trying to change that, at least certainly in East Asia, where it's trying to undermine US military primacy through its military modernization. It's trying to undermine American alliances. and the US ability to move freely around the region. So that's a change, and to the current US foreign policy, that is a threat. Secondly, in the realm of trade and economic development, China has a very statist approach to its economy, and the institutions that China is going to create and lead will reflect that and will reflect China's own interests. And along those lines, we should think about the portion of human rights within US goals and the goals of American partners. Within the post-World War II human rights regime, you could talk about all the ways that we messed it up and we're inconsistent and so on, and that's absolutely true. But the bottom line is we created a human rights regime and expanded it over time. This is not something that China is remotely interested in supporting, and indeed is going to be working hard to undermine. So if in all of these terms, the balance of power, the economic sphere, human rights, and so on, yeah, China's a threat.
What about you, Eugene? Do you agree, disagree?
Look, I think China, like Russia, is a powerful country in the world. They're an independent country. They make their own choices about what they want. They agree with us sometimes. They disagree with us sometimes. They're just a different country. Do they threaten us? Not in a meaningful way. They compete with us in trade. They offer us wonderful consumption opportunities. We buy lots of products from China. They lend us money sometimes when we want to borrow. They have positive relations with the United States in a lot of ways. Their military has gotten much better at brushing the United States back from their coast. Right? They're not a threat to go on a rampage around the world or come to the United States militarily. Right? They have built a lot of missiles that make it hard for the US Navy to operate, or the US Air Force to operate near China. And if our fear is that it's hard for us to go on the offense to support our allies in Asia militarily, because defense is getting stronger, because new technologies make defense stronger, we should remember that our strategic goals are actually defensive. We should use the same systems that we think make it hard for us to go on the offense against China to make it hard for China to go on the offense against our friends, right? So we could have a much more defensive defense, or a much more defensive orientation with our friends in Asia without picking a fight with China. And look, if there are threats that are not military threats, if there are threats to divide our democracy or cybersecurity threats, we should address those threats in those realms. But none of those make it any more efficient for the United States to buy another carrier strike group or another long-range bomber, or to spend $700 billion on our military, right? We should address those threats by spending a few $1 billion on cybersecurity. And that's a good expenditure. But on military affairs, we should take the cheaper and safer, less risky alternative and take advantage of technology to have a defensive defense. If missiles are effective, we should buy some missiles, or have encouraged Japan to buy some missiles to defend themselves. We don't have to pick a fight. We can just be on the defense.
Jake, you started out nodding no, and so I was going to come to you with the follow-up and ask you, and you ended up nodding yes. So.
Well, it's because for both of these guys, it's funny, I'm for an engaged America in the world. I'm also for cutting the defense budget. I do think spending $750 billion a year, where we added $50 billion last year, which over 10 years is $500 billion, which would pay for free college plus a lot of other things, is extraordinary. We should not do that. But I believe that there's nothing inconsistent with cutting the defense budget and maintaining forward deployment. I don't think forward deployment means war. I actually believe it means, in most cases in both Europe and Asia, preventing war, as it's done for the last 70 years. So I'll just give you an example of why I don't buy this idea that we should just draw back to Fortress America. In 2014, China and Japan, who are the second and third largest economies in the world, nearly went to war over a pile of rocks in the East China Sea called the Senkaku Islands. Okay, the Japanese had a few ships from their Coast Guard. The Chinese technically had ships from their Coast Guard as well. And President Obama was faced with a very tough choice. Does he say that Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan applies to these rocks? The idea that the United States is going to go to war over a pile of rocks in the East China Sea, I think we could all agree, seems pretty crazy. But by asserting that the US was going to have Japan's back, the net result was de-escalation. If the US pulls out and says, why doesn't Japan just build up a really big military and then see how it goes between Japan and China? I don't think we'd end up in a better circumstance for the United States. Now, in Eugene's technical definition of would the US homeland be harmed militarily, you could say one thing. But if the second and third largest economies go to war with one another, you don't think people in New Hampshire are going to feel the repercussions of that? Exactly. You can bet that they will. Yeah. And that goes to Constanze's point about Europe as well. So from my perspective, reducing the overall size of the US military, but keeping it deployed in a way in Europe and Asia that we can suck the oxygen out of the possibility of major power conflict, which has been the norm, not the exception, for centuries, is a better way for the United States to operate in the world. Last point, the reason we don't cut the defense budget is not because of the foreign policy establishment. It's because Bernie Sanders and Sherrod Brown, two great progressives, have major defense industries in their states, the F-35 and the Lima tank plant. They don't want to lose them. Neither does anybody else. I get that. So that's much more about domestic American politics than it is about the blob coming along and saying we need to spend an extra $100 billion on defense.
Let me ask one last question, and we'll turn it over to the audience. And I'm not going to direct it to anyone, just give you a chance to interact. I wanted to ask a question about climate change. If people in the audience want to, they can do so. I'm just out of time. But if we're going to have the five of you up here, I have to ask you guys a quick question about terrorism. And as probably all five of you know, if you just look at the data on deaths from terrorism, what you discover is fewer Americans die from terrorism. Before 9/11, when we weren't paying any attention, or after 9/11, after we were. Fewer Americans die from terrorism than die from, I think it's deer accidents, which, by the way, matter a lot in New Hampshire. But fewer die from terrorism than die from bathtub slips. And so I actually had a very renowned terrorism expert say to me recently, he said, yeah, we all know that terrorism is actually not that serious a threat to Americans, but the American public thinks it is, so we have to kind of go along. Is that your five views that, in fact, terrorism is a vastly exaggerated threat and that we should pay much fewer costs in civil liberties lost or dollars spent or people killed? Or do you actually think that terrorism is a major threat to the United States? Anybody wants to weigh in?
All right, why don't I start on that? Because I'm the guest in this country for the third time in my life, and I'm very fond of it. I will say that as somebody who wrote about security and defense in the 90s for a German national newspaper, I thought that when NATO after 9/11 reframed its sort of global operating paradigm to the global war against terror, that was a huge mistake. Yeah. And it has since been reframed. I frankly think that this reframing towards great power competition is accurate and reflects the reality of our lives. But I will say that the thing you might mention in this context is domestic terrorism. My country had domestic terrorism all through the 70s and the 80s, which was a fairly small group of people, but which managed to set German social peace, put German social peace in doubt in a way that was truly terrifying. I lived through that. I'm a Foreign Service child. One of my father's colleagues was killed in 1986. And you here have people shooting up mosques and synagogues, which I find truly, truly shocking, having lived in this country as a child and gone to graduate school there. How is this possible? How is it possible that a country that believes that the right to freedom of religion ought to be cherished as one of the foundational principles of American life is challenged in this way publicly? That, I think, is one of the key challenges, and not Islamic terrorism abroad, even although that will remain a challenge to forward-based militaries.
Just a very brief point on this. President Obama frequently would talk publicly about trying to deflate the threat of terrorism. He famously said you were more likely to die in a bathtub than die from a terrorist attack, and he paid a grievous political price for it. And I think the question isn't quite right to say, do you just have to go along with the public? I think an elected official has to ask the public their appetite for risk. And what the American public has sent back on the appetite for risk is we have zero tolerance. we have zero tolerance. And that requires us to build this massive counterterrorism industrial complex that has totally warped US foreign policy. Now, a leader could say, I don't care, you're just gonna have to live with some risk. And I think there should be an education process over time on that. But I do feel that, in part, elections are about people saying what's their level of risk tolerance, and the American people have demonstrated a very low level. And it's unfortunate because when you think about the actual threat of terrorism versus so many other challenges that we face, in terms of lives lost and the rest, it's not that high, but it is top of mind. This is not being invented in Washington and then put on the American people. There's just years of opinion research to show that this is what the American people are looking for, and it's just very hard to ask an elected official to ignore that.
So the topic of the debate is America's role in the world. And we can all agree that it sounds like the American people have an exaggerated feel of terrorism, but they're entitled to their fear of terrorism, and we should do something about it. I think that's okay. I think we do. And we could differ about the tactics of it one way or another. I might care more about civil liberties than most. But the Department of Homeland Security is the response to this, or the FBI is the response to this. Going and invading another couple of countries or making it a prominent foreign policy issue. I mean, some intelligence sharing could be part of this. That's all fine. But to use terrorism as a mechanism for justifying hundreds of billions of dollars in defense spending, buying another aircraft carrier, buying the F-35, deploying American troops overseas, this is a wrong-headed thing. If you want to respond to the American people's concern about terrorism, telling them that the way to respond is by fighting somebody over there is a dumb response, and we should stop doing it.
So now, let me switch over and start asking questions that we got from the audience. There's one about how important should be advancing humanitarian causes, preventing crimes against humanity. I'm sure that all of you are in favor of preventing crimes against humanity and advancing humanitarian causes, but where does the rubber meet the road in this? Should we be willing to intervene if knowing what we know about the horrors of Syria, right, which is ground on for almost a decade, killed hundreds of thousands of people, destabilized entire regions. Should we be willing, if we followed your foreign policies, would we be willing to make real cost sacrifices in order to prevent and engage in nasty civil wars like Syria or elsewhere?
Well, you stopped a genocide in Europe, and that was ours, and I'm thankful for it.
Yugoslavia.
No, I meant the Nazis.
Oh, we stopped a genocide, right?
Yes. And I'm grateful for that, and I think so is the rest of Europe. That was a significant achievement by America. And the world owes you, and we owe you, we Germans owe you for that. And so, yes, I have personal feelings about stopping genocide, as you would expect. And I covered the genocide in Rwanda. I was there, and I was in the Balkans, and I've covered the war crimes tribunals. And I feel, and I know from my personal experience and my personal analysis, we intervened too late in Rwanda, nearly too late in Yugoslavia. And frankly, I think that our intervention in Libya, while it turned out to be ignorant of the political conditions in which we intervened, probably stopped a massacre. And of course, driving the Taliban out of Afghanistan. And again, that intervention has led to mission creep and all sorts of other things. But it was legal and legitimate, and freed the people of Afghanistan who had been suffering under the Taliban. I was there in the early days. So yes, I think that under certain conditions, military intervention can be legal, can be legitimate, can be desirable, but we need to be extremely prudent and extremely careful about the way we prosecute it and about the way we continue it and about thinking how we leave it.
Other people?
So I'll briefly say about restraint. I think genocides are awful. We should be opposed to them. We should be willing to pay some cost to stop genocide. I think there's a problem that you face with manipulation when you don't understand the situation very well, a problem you face with making conflicts worse sometimes. You have to be cautious about intervening in conflicts overseas. But if you were serious about wanting to prevent genocides, I think you should support a strategy of restraint in the sense that if we have limited attention and limited appetite and limited investments to make in national security affairs, in intelligence, why didn't we intervene in Rwanda? We didn't understand in time what was happening, and we blamed it. We misidentified the problem in Rwanda, and it was partly because there was one guy in the DIA who was covering multiple countries in Africa at the time, and we didn't have people on the ground diplomatically because we didn't invest adequately in kind of monitoring or looking for the kind of intelligence that you would collect if that was the threat you were worried about. We were focused on mistaken strategic threats. We were focused on harassing Iraq at the time. We were focused on a mistaken legacy, a misunderstanding of the analogy between Somalia and Rwanda. So if instead of what we currently invest huge amounts of money and attention on in terms of tactical intelligence on terrorists in the Middle East that are not interested in attacking the United States but are interested in local troubles in the Middle East, or an overinvestment in intelligence in Russia or China or wherever it is, if we wanted to monitor and understand potential genocides around the world for the very rare occasions when there was a serious need to intervene for potential genocide, you would want to cut back on the investment we're making in intelligence over here and actually pay attention to intelligence over there, which would allow us to make judgments about situations like Rwanda.
Stephen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I would never close the door to humanitarian intervention. I think if something as horrific as, say, the Rwandan genocide is happening and the United States could realistically intervene to stop that and actually do good and save a lot of lives in the end, that is always something to consider. However, I have to say that after studying this issue for a little while, I find the instances in which that threshold that I've just described would actually be met to be very few. There are very few examples of humanitarian interventions where we can confidently say that we've actually done good. And if you look at the way humanitarian interventionists like Samantha Power have written about the cause of humanitarian intervention, the animating impulse is often to do something to stop evil and not so much to do good. And the use of military force is a very blunt instrument to actually try to save people's lives. So I think what I conclude from this is that we need to appreciate, yes, humanitarianism, human rights, democracy for that matter. These are all important values, but when we try to promote these values in a way that contradicts the value of peace and conflict resolution, almost always the outcomes aren't good. So we need to put more weight on peace as an important American value as well.
I would just add also, I like the way Eugene talked before about the different appropriate institutions and tools for meeting the terrorist threat, and that maybe it's Homeland Security and FBI rather than aircraft carriers and so on. So for humanitarian intervention, we can also ask ourselves, are we using the right lens? Are the appropriate tools really these military interventions, which as Stephen noted, are a very blunt instrument that have very difficult logistical and ethical and all sorts of problems. So we shouldn't close them off, obviously, like everybody's saying. But what about other tools that we do have that don't suffer from those problems? So just simple preventing diseases, water purification, all these things. Our colleague here, Ben Valentino, wrote a foreign affairs essay about the different way that we could approach humanitarian intervention in the sense of, again, institution building, disease prevention, good governance, and so on. So that's another angle on this.
Let me ask you guys one last question, and then I think we're out of time, shockingly, which is, say again? 5 minutes, but they're going to want to talk about this. Which is, so Constanze raised before, said, we're talking about these, political partnerships and military alliances, but this is all in the context of both societal connections and global economic connections. And oftentimes, when we talk about the global economy, it's even in this context, it's only as a constraint to conflict, which is good if it's true. But I'm guessing that there's more to what Constanze is suggesting than simply that, which is there's an argument on the table that basically says that we can't have the benefits of these deep social connections between the United States and the many countries with whom we have close connections in Asia, in Europe, and increasingly in sub-Saharan Africa. We can't enjoy the close economic connections and the benefits of globalization unless we also have something akin to these alliance networks and these military relations. And the question for you is that true? Are these all deeply connected? Or can you have the benefits of economic globalization and a single world without these military ties and without these military commitments around the world? And I'm not sure if I cast what you were saying accurately, so let me just kind of give you the opportunity to begin.
Thank you.
And then hear from each
I
of
think
you.
that's a really, really interesting question. And I think that there are, as long as there are hostile actors in the world, others are going to have to protect themselves. And because so many of these threats transcend boundaries, that is a rationale for forming alliances. Yeah? Because alliances are an economical way of protecting ourselves, right? And it's just not a coincidence that we would form alliances with countries with whom we share not just tangible or quantifiable interests, but also values. Yeah? And I think that is what takes the Western alliance beyond its Cold War or post-Cold War rationale. Is that this web of connectivity is so deep, and that we prize it, and that we prize the mobility of people, goods, data, and ideas. Because that is what we base much of our innovation, our ability to innovate on, our capability to find social progress. But I think the one thing that we haven't talked about here yet, and that I do want to raise, and that to me is crucial, which I think is the lesson of about the last 4 or 5 years, which is that not just the legitimacy of our foreign and security policy, but its efficacy, its effectiveness, is rooted in the legitimacy and effectiveness, and dare I say, the decency of our domestic models. And that if our domestic models are polarized, are unjust, fundamentally unjust, are fundamentally cruel, and as we, I think, are seeing, it is possible for Western democracies to become cruel and to question their own models, then we will also lose legitimacy internationally and lose the ability to pursue our interests, not just our values, but even our interests. And that, to me, is a crucial point.
Anybody else?
Well, I agree with Constanze that trade, cultural exchange, investment, shared data, crossing borders, all of this stuff is super important. I just don't see how it requires particular military relationships between the United States and other countries. China manages to trade with lots of countries in the world without having military alliances with them. I think people want to trade with the United States because they want products that we make, we want products that they make, and there's a productive exchange between the countries. Trade actually occurs in times of tension and in times of peace, in times of war and in times of peace. Wars are tremendously costly and awful experiences, especially for the people who choose to fight them. But world trade adjusts, it continues. It can continue under different conditions. There was trade during the Cold War when the world was tense and when the world was not so tense. I think everything that Constanze is saying about an interest in shared values and discussing those shared values is important and a good idea. It just doesn't require a particular military role for the United States in the world. And I think trade is the same way. And I think it's it's a mistake to believe that it requires the exercise of power and the strong effort of powerful countries to bring about any equilibrium in the world. There are emergent properties, things that happen through the natural decentralized interactions of people around the world that don't require one country to pull the strings and make those things happen. And trade is one of those things, and it's great that it is.
So the bad news is, the buzzing on the iPad tells me that we're out of time. The good news is we do have enough time for each of you to give a 2-minute closing statement. So this is where you can eviscerate the arguments of your opponents and kind of bring everything you said to fruition. why don't we go in the same order we did last time? Jenny had to go last time. She'll get the last word this time. So why don't I go Constanze, Eugene, Jake, Steve, and Jenny.
Okay. I'm going to make this very simple. It seems clear to me that America is exhausted and overextended, and that its domestic peace has suffered from that. But I would immensely regret an America that withdraws from its role as a protector of international order, and that reneges on the fundamental values that it has protected abroad and that its constitutional order domestically represents. And I see both of those in question now, and that I find that heartbreaking, and I hope that stops.
Eugene?
I think there are many good things that happen in the world. I don't think we have to be responsible for all of those things. I think there are many bad things that happen in the world, and I think it's unfortunate that sometimes we are responsible for those things. In fact, in the last 25 years, the United States has been responsible for a shockingly high proportion of bad things that have happened in the world, right? We've been an agent of instability and making things worse in a way that we didn't need to. We've scored a lot of own goals in the last 25 years, and we should stop, right? We should stop the hubris. We should stop pretending that we're necessary, and we should stop pretending that it's not costly for the United States. It's been a rough 25 years. We've spent a lot of money. We've run up our debt. Americans have died. We've made enemies around the world. We've taken on what I think is an unfortunate moral stain in some cases because of the mistakes we've made, right? I believe that we're a fundamentally good country and can achieve good things, and we've gotten ourselves in a position where bad things have happened because of us. I think it's wrong to not understand the costs of these things. We're spending huge amounts of money and increasing amounts of money. We're fighting into the teeth. We're spending lots of money to preserve our offensive capability against other countries at a time when we say that our strategic aims are defensive. Right? We could pull back and be defensive about this, and we could pay down our debt, and we could prepare for a situation where if the world ever really gets worse for the United States, we would have the resources to be able to respond to that situation. And our alliances are not free. In some ways, they're like the off-balance sheet liabilities that Enron got into trouble for 20 years ago, right? That they hid the potential risks, and when those risks came to fruition, suddenly Enron couldn't pay the bill. Right? Well, so just because we haven't had a war that's cost the United States tremendous resources in Europe or in Asia doesn't mean that it's a good idea to expose ourselves to that risk unnecessarily. Right? That is an off-balance sheet liability, just we haven't paid the cost yet, but it is a real cost for the United States, and we should be very concerned about that. We should choose instead a policy of restraint that reduces our exposure to huge costs.
Jake?
It's interesting. I think about these things from the perspective of someone who's served in government. And I didn't mean to say you didn't. I didn't. So just that I did. The reason I raise that is because I think it exposes a certain blind spot that those of us who serve in government have, which is we worry about certain kinds of downside risks. So I want to go back to Daryl's last question, which was, could we end our alliances and still trade with everyone and have great relationships in Europe and Asia? I think there is no doubt that Eugene is right, that there's nothing inherent in the trading relationships of the world that you have to have military alliances to make them good. But that's not actually the question. The question is, now that we have them, if we withdrew from them, would it come at a cost to the United States in terms of our solidarity and capacity to work with our friends in Europe and Asia to deal with what I think is one of the great challenges of our time, which is the distortionary effect of China's state-led economy in the international system that is harming American workers and for which we need new rules. And we need a united front of countries to build those new rules. And I would posit that if I went to the president and said, here's the deal, first we withdraw from Europe and Asia militarily. But don't worry, that will have no impact on the Europeans or Asians on whether they'll work with us against China vis-a-vis. I just don't think human nature works that way. It may be true, but I wouldn't want to be the one taking that gamble. Particularly since where I disagree is that I don't regard our alliances in Europe and Asia as fundamentally exposing the United States to the kind of off-balance sheet liabilities that Eugene is talking about. I do think military intervention in the Middle East produces those liabilities. I don't think that is a function of our alliances. Last point. I was part of the team that began the negotiations over the Iran nuclear deal, going for a year in secret doing shuttle diplomacy to try to produce that agreement. I believe that we got that agreement at least in part because of the credible threat of military force. I do. And I asked the question, if we just completely withdrew and said we're pulling back to America, could we stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? Would I want to go to war with Iran? Absolutely not. But I believe that in order to produce positive diplomatic outcomes for the world and to have peace in the world, you do need to have that credible threat. And to me, that does require some measure of forward deployment, properly used. Thank you.
Stephen.
Great. I'll just make a comment first, is that I'm not hearing an alternative on this stage at least that suggests that there might not be military force or the U.S. should withdraw to Fortress America, but rather I'm hearing an alternative that's about encouraging burden sharing among allies, but still playing a substantial military role. So I don't think the question is whether there will be force in the world. The question is whose force and where. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is really important because we've just had a whole debate and I didn't want to misrepresent. Are you saying you would be keeping substantial U.S. forces in Europe and Asia?
It depends, but I'm not saying that any alliance commitment should necessarily be abrogated, but I do think a substantial reduction in the forward deployment could be done, but that should be done in a responsible way in partnership with our allies. So I want to make the point, I don't know if anyone's noticed, that America's political system appears to be, unfortunately, increasingly dysfunctional. And I think we need to think about, all right, some people have noticed. I seriously think that we need to think about the implications of that for American global power, because the case for American supremacy has always rested on an assumption that the United States political system was uniquely enlightened, or at least competent enough to make consistent and decent decisions affecting much of the world. But now we've had, in my view, several presidents who have married aggressive visions with careless decisions. And we've seen not a lot of accountability for disastrous policies like the war in Iraq. I wonder how many of us can honestly say, can honestly agree with Madeleine Albright 2 decades ago when she said that the United States was the indispensable nation because it stands tall and can see farther than other countries into the future. So my concern here is that it won't be sufficient for the next administration just to have the most brilliant and decent and just grand strategy, and then to turn over in 4 or 8 years the apparatus of U.S. power to a fundamentally irresponsible actor. So we also need to think about democratizing the making of our foreign policy, which means upgrading the role of Congress in the foreign policy process, and also having events like this one where there's a real exchange of views so that citizens can appreciate the issues, get a sense of the alternatives, and have some agency. Thank you.
So in addition to trying to not fall off this bar stool, I've been listening very carefully. That actually takes a tremendous amount of energy. I've been listening really carefully to Eugene and Jake and noticing kind of interesting tension in the different points that they're making. And Eugene's pointing out the liabilities that we have accepted as part of these alliances, and the U.S. leaders saying, hey, in order to reassure Japan, we have to make this declaration that, we will essentially trade Seattle for the Senkaku Islands, because that's what we've done. And I don't know if you guys know that, but there's a bunch of rocks, and American blood is now committed to defending those rocks against a nuclear-armed adversary. And that's a pretty big liability, right? And then contrast that to, as Jake discussed it earlier, he said the fact that we did that, the fact that we made that promise is what's going to mean we're never going to have to fight over those rocks. And so there's this interesting tension here. There's the belief, I guess it comes down to the faith that you have in the strength of the deterrent? And is this war ever going to happen? Have you made it less likely to happen because you've made that promise? It's a pretty big risk that you're taking on, especially in this kind of post-red line world, right, where everybody's going to say, oh, look at Obama, he didn't defend the red line and he got excoriated for it. So it's a dangerous game to play. But I just wanted to highlight these two views that are out there. The one view that Jake was making, which says, by virtue of making that pledge, we won't have to fight that war. And contrasting that against the very, very high level of risk that is going to be different in different circumstances, right? So maybe in this kind of weird, kind of gray area naval scenario that we're talking about, maybe this pledge was justified and it actually doesn't lead to this huge risk of war. But maybe in other areas, it might be a dangerous thing to do. But I think it's an important tension to pick up on there.
So it's my job to turn this over for the final remarks to Bruce Jones of Brookings. But before I do, let me just kind of echo something which was briefly said on stage, but it's the idea that was said today that I believe in the most. And that is, and it's one that probably all five of our debaters agree with, which is that that what's most important here is the ability of people who disagree with each other strongly to have civil, sharp, and reasoned debate, even though they disagree. That frankly, that's the cornerstone of our society. That's the cornerstone of what academia brings to the table here in these debates. And so thank all five of you for participating in this. Thank you to Brookings. Thank you to Brookings, thank you to Charles Koch Institute, and thank you to the Dickey Center. And with that, let me turn it over to Bruce.
Well, and thank you, Daryl. And to get five people who are knowledgeable, thoughtful, but, used to the rough and tumble of debate to do so in a civil way also takes a great moderator. And so I appreciate, Daryl, the role that you played. But seriously, thank you to Jake, to Eugene, to Jenny, to Constanze, to Stephen. I thought it was an hour that illustrated exactly the point that Daryl just said. People can disagree, but they can do so in civil ways. And over the course of that discussion, guess what? You learn. I learned things by listening to the people I agreed with and the people I disagreed with. And the debate evolved. And I thought the contrasts were sharpened as we went. And the discourse was elevated as a consequence. I've listened to this debate over the last year working with CKI. And it seems to me that those who are arguing for a more restrained foreign policy have, over that course of time, become more specific in the things that they're arguing for and what risks they think we're avoiding and what risks we think we're taking. And those who are in favor of a more engaged foreign policy have also become more willing to open up on what their assumptions are and to expose what costs we think we're willing to bear and why, and what we think we're gaining by taking on those costs, what risk we're avoiding by taking those costs. The debates get sharper, the debates get more specific, and as a consequence, it seems to me, voters will be confronted with more real, more specific, more honest choices about our foreign policy, and that's an extremely good thing and a real example, I think, of the role that academics and think tanks can play in trying to kind of clarify major issues that confront American democracy. So I've been delighted to be part of this, and I want to thank Will Ruger for his leadership in helping stimulate this civic debate around these critical issues for our country. Thank you to all of you. My thanks in particular today to Dan and the Dickey Center for being our hosts and for creating the framework in which this conversation happened. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for participating tonight. We are going to be continuing this series. Several other countries around, several other countries, several other cities. We can go and have a debate in Germany about it. Several other cities around the country where we'll continue this discussion. Chicago, Miami, Denver, some more to be determined. You can follow this debate online. We always write this up. The video will be posted. I hope you stay engaged with us. And thank you again, all of you, for being here tonight.